Hi, I'm Corey Guilford, and this is my devotion for homiletics. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I want to start off with the story. I remember when I was a teenager, my family went on a trip to Arkansas. It was a camping trip, and we were going through the Green Mountains, and we got a camping spot that was adjacent to a lake. And we also had brought our dogs with us. And we got into a little bit of trouble when we decided that we were going to rent a boat and go out onto the lake just kind of for some recreational rowing, I guess you would call it. And it was really kind of frustrating. It started out with the dogs jumping into the water and they'd get back in the boat and we'd have to pull them out of the water really because dogs like to swim. But the worst trouble came when we had rowed halfway into the lake and we found that we could not row back to the launching place because the wind was so hard against our boat that no matter how much we rowed, we couldn't make any movement. It was really frustrating and it was kind of desperate. And when we rowed as much as we couldn't row anymore. And in fact, the more that we rowed, the farther from the dock we got. My dad decided, hey, I'm just going to jump out into the water. I'm going to pull the boat to the shore opposite the dock, the far end of the lake. And he pulled the boat all the way back to our starting point. And that was really frustrating. It was an interesting experience. It really demonstrated how strong wind can be. And it reminds me of a story in the Gospels, another story about a time that the disciples got into a precarious situation. And you're going to find this in Matthew chapter 14. And after this long day of work, healing, and teaching, it says in verse 22, immediately he, Jesus, made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. I know what that's like. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it is a ghost. And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. I think the traditional way that we view this passage, at least speaking for myself, is that the disciples are on the water, they're on their way back, and all of a sudden, some supernatural storm whips up, and lightning's going everywhere. The water's coming over the side. Rain is just hitting them in the face. It's dark and it's scary, but I'm not actually sure that this is accurate, because if we think about this, if it was a rainstorm, the disciples probably knew the signs because many of them were experienced fishermen. They would have seen clouds in the sky. They would have sought shelter long before there was a storm. But there's another type of storm that happened, and it's what we call a winter windstorm. And these storms came from the top of the surrounding Golan Heights, and they came suddenly and they came forcefully, and fishermen feared these types of storms. And as fast as they come, they would end very suddenly. And this is probably the kind of storm that the disciples found them in, not a rainstorm, but a windstorm. And the Bible says that Jesus came to them in the fourth watch of the night. So this is a time that was between 3 and 6 in the morning. They had been on the water from evening to the middle of the night. And now this figure walking on the water comes to them out of nowhere in the dark. So it's not surprising that a bunch of uneducated, common folk thought that he was a ghost. Not only were they caught off guard by a dangerous windstorm, stuck in the dead of night, but they were sent into the situation by Jesus himself. Remember, Matthew says that Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him. It was an order. He told them to go. Looking back on the story from our modern perspective, it's really easy to see that this wasn't an accident. This was something Jesus planned out. This was something he set up. Jesus put them into this situation. And sometimes we find ourselves in the same boat, right? We follow Jesus. We've done what he says. We've walked where he walks. And when he says go, we go. We're obedient. And for all of the faithfulness, for all of the work, the winds of life come and they beat us back. For every 2 steps forward, we slide back 5 steps, and a family member gets a cancer diagnosis. The money runs dry. Our leadership says no. And all of a sudden, we begin to wonder, where's Jesus? Has he abandoned us? He sent us here. Where is he at? And in the middle of the darkness, we see what looks like a ghost on the water. And if you've ever been in a desperate place, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In a moment of desperation, in a moment of chaos, and in the midst of prayer, we hear the whisper, take heart. Is that you, God? Is that you? And Jesus says to the disciples, he says, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And what is our response when Jesus has taken us to the middle of a storm and has the audacity to say, don't be afraid? I like what Peter does. Peter sees Jesus walking on the water and he thinks, hey, I want more. I want to do that. It says in verse 28, Peter answered him, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. He says, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. And I find it humorous that Jesus criticizes Peter's faith. It seems from my perspective that Peter had the most faith. The other disciples were watching the show from the boat, afraid to do anything different than what they'd been doing. But Peter had lots of faith. But at the end of the day, it only carried Peter halfway to Jesus. And Jesus was looking for a faith that would finish. I'm approaching my 30s, and the frustrating and interesting thing is that the older I get, the less I know. The older I get, the more questions I have. I've got more questions about faith than when I was 18. And you'd think that at this point, I would just know everything. But it really kind of makes sense because, I was dumb at 18. I had my parents' faith. And at the end of the day, that's not the kind of faith that finishes. That's enough faith to start following Jesus. It's enough faith to step out of the boat, but it's not enough to finish. And now I'm working on a new faith at this point. And often it feels like I'm Peter, not the Peter still walking on the water. I'm more like Peter drowning in the sea. It's not that Peter didn't trust Jesus. He didn't trust the process. He didn't trust the journey. He thought it was odd that he was walking on the same water that sank boats, that drowned men, and he's walking on top of it. And Peter was doing something that he'd never even read about. There's no prophet that walked on water. Moses and Joshua had split the sea, sure, but they walked on dry land. Only Jesus walked on the water. And Peter wanted to be like Jesus, but he didn't have the faith to finish. But at the end of the day, Peter knew who to call on. When he sank, he called on Jesus. And I think it's great if you've got miraculous faith, and we all want that, but there's no better faith than the faith to call on Jesus when you don't know how you're going to finish. I love how Jesus meets Peter halfway. He picks him up, he leads him to safety, and calms the storm. I don't know where you're at with your faith, but I'd like to encourage you, have faith in Jesus. Even when you feel like you can't measure up, have faith in Jesus. I love the way that the author of Hebrews writes, therefore, since we are surrounded By so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so easily, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God. Your faith might not be perfect. Your belief might not be perfect, but Jesus is the founder and perfecter of our faith. He's the answer. He's the better sacrifice. He's the missing piece. He's the better priest. He's the mediator between God and man when we fail. And he's not mad at you. He's ready to use faith as small as a mustard seed to move mountains in your life. If we cry out, if we reach out and trust in him. Sometimes our faith fails, but God knows already, and he's ready to carry us to safety. Thank you.